Hey, it's Rowan, and there's a lot more of you than there was before my last video. If you subscribed because of that cottagecore video, then hello, you're probably interested in seeing kind of vaguely interesting gay stuff that I then go into like way more historical detail and context than anyone ever asked for, in which case, you're gonna like this video as well. And statistically, if you were subscribed before that, you either came from my Captain Marvel video, which, you know, you enjoy chaotic gay energy, or one of my queerbaiting videos, in which case you love just being hurt. I decided to combine all three of those things into this video, so we are going to be looking at 29 movie characters who should have been gay, a deep dive. Think of me as your English Miss Frizzle, and this video is our magic school bus. Incidentally, if anyone wants to draw me as Miss Frizzle, like in one of her dresses, I will literally give you my firstborn. But we are about to take a journey together into the past. So people who are attracted to people of the same gender is nothing new, it's something that's always existed. However, our social idea of a gay identity is more recent. So to demonstrate this, let's look at romantic friendship. That is platonic or non-sexual relationships between people of the same gender that go beyond what is typical for Western limitations of platonic relationships. It's useful to point out here that this is pretty tied up with the gender binary when I say different genders. Traditionally, we are talking about men, and cis women. I think as soon as we get into trans identities and non-binary genders, genderqueer individuals, things like that, we're already kind of queering or changing those traditional ideas of what it is to be a normal person with a platonic relationship. So the concept of romantic friendships is only even conceived of as a category because it goes beyond the limitations of the Western understanding of friendship at the time that that friendship is being labelled as a romantic friendship. If the mainstream concept of what was platonic behaviour stretched to include some elements that we thought of as romantic coded, like open verbal and written expressions of love, massages and hand-holding, sleeping in the same bed every night with no sexual relationship, then it wouldn't be notable at all, just part of friendship culture in general. We can see the ways in which our Western interpretation of the line between platonic and romantic can affect our interpretation and reading of relationships in the example of Chinese streetwear TikTok. Commenters on these TikToks, and sometimes the creators of the videos themselves, often assume that the girls holding hands in these videos are dating, because that is what we assume when we see people holding hands in public. Almost every TikTok comment section in these videos will have teenagers gushing excitedly about how cute the sapphic couples in the video are. However, as Chinese replies are quick to point out, it isn't actually that unusual in China to see female friends on a very platonic level holding hands in public. A social interpretation from one culture or historical period is then placed onto another, and it can be seen as false. In a historical context, romantic friendship is a phrase used to describe close relationships between people of the same gender in times when being gay was not a recognised identity. But here's the thing, historically, how do we know that those relationships weren't sexual? Because of the level of taboo in regards to queer relationships at the time, oftentimes in countries it literally being illegal or punishable by imprisonment, castration, or death to admit your queerness, you can understand how even in private missives in letters or in diaries, people wouldn't openly be talking about the sexual elements of their relationship. Even notorious lesbian icon Anne Lister's diary was written in code and almost destroyed by the men who found and decoded it later on. But equally, we cannot assume that all of these relationships were sexual by default. Luckily for us, in this video, we are talking about real historical characters. We are talking about fictional ones, and the author is dead, baby! But looking at the ways in which we interpret signs of romance, attraction, and sexuality in real life can give us a sense why so many people see queer pairings or characters or potential in movies in which apparently there aren't any. Our concept of queerness has changed over the years. So what does it look like now? What are the indicators? So of course we have queer coding, queer baiting, and queer catching, which I covered to a ridiculous extent in a previous video series. I will put a link somewhere if you're interested in that. Now these are elements specific to queerness, the way that a character talks or dresses that have been traditionally linked to outward expressions of queerness. However, we also have things like romance coding, which transcend specific sexualities, characters who seem to have romantic potential based on the particular things that we see as romantic on screen. The music that's used in the background of a screen, the way they physically interact with each other, the language they use to describe each other, even the narrative that surrounds them can all contribute to the sense that this might be a potential romantic couple. And we see it often in films where there is an eventual canon straight couple. We are seated with these ideas, big classic trope of this, especially with heterosexual couples, is the enemies to lovers trope. The idea that there are these two characters who absolutely hate each other, but we know because we understand the conventions of romance on screen that they will eventually end up together. So some characters in this video are queer coded, some are romance coded, and then some, honestly, I just thought it would be more like interesting or fun or fitting for them to be gay. For each of them I'll be talking about the ideas behind their inclusion on this list, but I think it's important to remember that we don't have to have a reason to have a queer character. We don't need to default to straight until we have like a very special episode of a TV show or like the gay best friend. We shouldn't have to prove that we should be included, even though it's what I'm basically gonna do in this video now. So I've split these characters into 4 categories. 1, if this was a man and a woman, you'd have made it canon. 2, look, it just would have been better if it was gay. 3, I mean, come on, this whole thing is already so gay, like, who are you trying to fool? And 4, the very concept, nay, the very foundation that you walk upon is homosexual. And yet you deny our power? Foolish mortals! This category is also known as people have already made an argument for it, or it's basically there already, or this is a little bit of cheeky queer baiting, isn't it? Now this category often has elements of queer coding, that is the way that which characters interact or their mannerisms, kind of showing a stereotypical element of queerness, oftentimes to do with characters who are not explicitly queer in the piece of media itself. This was used in movies across the 20th century in order to show queerness to an audience during a time of censorship when you couldn't openly talk about having queer characters on screen. And the practice from that time of censorship is so ingrained within Hollywood that oftentimes filmmakers will replicate it without necessarily realizing why. And this is a particularly clear example in the case of Disney villains. Again, I've done a video about it. I feel like I've done a video about everything gay in film at this point, so I will link that somewhere as well if you're interested. So although queer coding is traditionally linked to villains or characters that need to be pitied in some way, more recently, specifically within children's media, we've seen queer coding used by queer-friendly creators in order to start to edge towards some kind of representation, even if they can't do it openly and explicitly within the piece of media itself. So in this section I want to talk about couples or characters that have a legitimate queer reading, specifically because if we look at the romance coding surrounding them, this would have been an obvious choice had the couple been a straight one. The characters aren't necessarily queer coded themselves, but the way that they interact with the narrative and the characters around them show that they definitely could be. But you know, heteronormativity is one hell of a drug. We're gonna begin at the beginning and start off with the 1950s classic, Singing in the Rain. So Singing in the Rain is a comedy musical which basically deals with a group of actors in the 1920s attempting to make the transition from silent movies to talkies. At the centre of the story are silent movie star Don, his best friend Cosmo, and his love interest Kathy. So if someone showed me this film and told me that it was secretly actually about a polyamorous relationship, I would believe them. It combines the enemies to lovers trope of Don and Kathy, which, as I previously mentioned, is an absolute staple in straight relationships on film, plus the friends to lovers trope with Don and Cosmo, who have a very established kind of besties relationship, to make what has the potential to be an extremely cute relationship. And you would literally not have to change anything to make this happen. Like, the entire plot follows these 3 characters all the way through. But of course we know from our film history that not just a polyamorous relationship, but any kind of queerness would not have made it through the censors of the Hays Code that was in place at the time. This was a time in which Hollywood was under a kind of self-imposed censorship that meant that you would definitely not see any kind of happy, healthy queer relationship on screen, alongside a load of other kind of things that they censored to do with like wrongdoing or sin. But this movie is an interesting example of a subtext which a lot of people have picked up on, which is not necessarily demonizing or negative. The famous and honestly delightful song Good Morning is basically them singing about how they've stayed up all night together talking and saving the day and how excited they are about it. In the song itself, the choreography of all 3 mirrors each other. Cosmo and Don dance with Kathy in the same way. Plus, in an extremely scientific piece of evidence, on the fanfic site AO3, Don, Cosmo, Kathy is the top romantic ship of the movie. So like, the people have spoken. Okay, so I was gonna leave that fanfic line in just as like a fun joke, but then as I do, started looking more into it, and I have actual thoughts. So as I was going through my notes, I actually checked on AO3 for each of the different films and found that, yeah, all of these couples, all of these queer couples rank higher in terms of popularity than heterosexual couples. The only example of a film where this wasn't the case was Rogue One. Now, fanfic has its historical origins in queerness. From those very first fanzines about Kirk and Spock to the, half a dozen AO3 tabs currently open on my laptop beside me, I genuinely think that this says something interesting about the power of transformative fan works like fan fiction on queer representation. I could honestly make a whole video about why fanfic is so queer. I guess if you want to see that, let me know in the comments. But here's a Cliff Notes version. Fanfiction allows us to improve and expand on existing media, and that media is produced by companies which traditionally have been gatekeepers for LGBTQ+ content, either because they explicitly don't want it or because what they assume will sell is something that isn't queer. But fanfic is non-commercial. It doesn't matter if they don't think it's going to sell to a wide, broad audience that might be homophobic or wary of going to see a piece of queer media. Fanfic means that you can write what you want. And so a lot of people flock to it because they are not seeing themselves in mainstream media. And so it's no accident that queer pairings are so popular in fandom because they have so often been left out of mainstream media. And fanfic allows people to see themselves and write themselves into these kind of, rom-coms and thrillers and sci-fi stories and coming of age narratives that they never normally see themselves reflected in. A more recent movie that had audiences convinced of its queerness is, of course, Captain Marvel with Carol and Maria. So I made a whole goddamn video about this one. I will leave a link to it somewhere. I don't want to just repeat everything I said there, but to summarise: 1. They are raising a child together. 2. Carol regains her lost memories by thinking about Maria in a classic romantic trope. And 3. Their storyline in that movie directly parallels the storyline of a straight couple in the movie. And yet they don't make it gay. And whereas Singing in the Rain was made in an era in which a poly relationship just would not have been a thing you'd have been able to put on mainstream film, this was made in 2019, you guys. The fact that we're still waiting for an out queer lead in an MCU movie is honestly embarrassing for them. We're looking at the Eternals to give us the first queer lead in an ensemble piece. Let's see how long it takes to get a solo film, I guess. The lack of queer representation in these big blockbuster films that have kind of been slowly increasing diversity in other areas it's an unfortunate reality for several reasons. One is the fear that queer films will not make it past the censors in the international market, particularly in China. You can cut out a small cameo here or a tiny mention with a character over there, but if you're going to have queerness at the center of a movie or have a romantic couple in that movie that's queer, you can't just cut out those scenes for censors. It becomes unreleasable. But I think it's important to note that it's not just international audiences that are pushing this. In the UK and the US, we have portions of the population who inherently see queerness as inappropriate for these kind of family blockbuster movies or any movie that caters to kids and teens. Even if these queer characters were to adhere to the exact same romantic actions as the straight counterparts do in those movies, which are not seen as inappropriate, it would still be seen as inappropriate specifically because they are queer. And speaking of the MCU, let's talk about everyone's favourite ride or die besties. It's Captain America and the Winter Soldier, or Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes. This relationship had such potential, and yet. Now this is a pairing that is very widely recognised. In 2019, there was a survey of like 17,000 people on shipping across all different fandoms, and Stucky, the name for the relationship, came out on top of the list of every other pairing. The Captain America films revolve around these two and the lengths that Steve will go for Bucky. Everything from ignoring orders during the Second World War so he can rescue Bucky from behind enemy lines, to going rogue and defying the authorities and half of the Avengers to protect Bucky in the 21st century. And of course there's the iconic line, "I'm with you to the end of the line," which has such connotations of loyalty and devotion and forever. It's just so romance coded. It is the kind of line that absolutely, if it was a man and a woman who had that line, said it to each other and was used as a callback, that would be a romantic relationship. But instead of allowing for even the possibility of an off-screen happy ending for these two men, in Endgame, they made Steve go back in time to spend his life with his love interest from the first movie, Peggy Carter. And so we can see this as a really good example of this underlying idea which has existed from way back centuries ago, that the ultimate happy ending is a romantic heterosexual relationship. It ties into this idea that romantic love and marriage is the end goal and a reward for good and virtuous characters. This is incidentally the same impulse that brought us things like the Harry Potter epilogue, for example. And we see this attitude of a nuclear traditional family being the end goal across the MCU. Take Natasha, for example. She sees herself as a monster because she's infertile. Now, to my mind, this makes her heroic sacrifice in Endgame even more the worst because it kind of implies that her life is worth less than Hawkeye's, incidentally a mass murderer's, simply because he's a father and she can't have a family. And Peggy, as we see from her own TV show and her interactions with Steve in the MCU, has her own life. She moved on from Steve. In fact, a large portion of her character arc during her own TV series was getting over that lost love. She got married, she had children, she founded S.H.I.E.L.D., like she's doing okay. She wasn't like waiting for Steve, breathless at the prospect of his return. She moved on and created her own independent life. And so as well as shutting down any possibility of an off-screen romance for Bucky and Steve after the end of the movie, it also just felt like a bit of a kick in the teeth to that character to have her be reduced to the love interest of Steve Rogers. Many people have noted the ways in which filmmakers in the later films separated Steve and Bucky after the popularity of that pairing due to the earlier movies. Also noting how significant scenes like Steve and Bucky reuniting in Wakanda aren't shown on screen. In this way, I'm in agreement with one Twitter user, @EstherAnna, who said, Steve and Bucky are constantly forced apart by the narrative because their relationship's built on delayed expressions of affection, and if they interacted for more than 5 minutes, the narrative would have to address these affections and their inherent homoeroticism. Most of the suggestions on this list come in the form of a pair, a potential romantic relationship. And that makes sense because we're taking into account things like the chemistry between characters and actors, and it also allows us to avoid falling into potential stereotypes of what, is inherently gay within a single character. However, sometimes queerness is literally referenced in the text, but is not utilized to its full extent. And oh my god, is that the case with Janice Ian in Mean Girls. In the movie, Janice reveals she used to be friends with the antagonist Mean Girl Regina when they were younger. However, they stopped being friends when Regina began to suspect Janice was a lesbian who had a crush on her and spread the rumour throughout the school. The film uses lesbianism as a nasty rumour to be ashamed of, evidence of Regina's villainy. There's this kind of underlying implication that it isn't the outing of a teen girl which is the bad thing, it's calling her a lesbian in the first place. Janice clearly has a lot of anger and trauma that she's trying to deal with around this event, and that is so rife for an interesting nuanced exploration of teen sexuality. Like, we could have explored the experience of being outed before you're even out to yourself, or the specific vicious kind of homophobia that lesbians get from other girls, or even finding happiness as a teen gay girl, but we didn't. At the end of the movie, Janice is dating a boy, and obviously bisexuality exists, but this was clearly not meant to be that. It was meant to be Janice being straight and her lesbianism being a nasty rumour that Regina had made up. They gave us a whole outing storyline, and we didn't even get a lesbian out of it. You know what, just to add a little fun, just a little splash of random, a little something for the family action comedy fans out there, we're going to include Jed and Octavius from Night at the Museum. You know the story. Exhibits at a museum come to life. There's little mini dioramas of the Wild West and a Roman town next to each other. They are bitter rivals, but the leaders of both come together, become reluctant friends, and eventually, if there was any justice in the world, something more. These characters are always together in the movies. Their storylines always revolve in either fighting each other or later on saving each other's lives. And the movie itself absolutely knows what it's doing with this subtext. Jed, the cowboy character played by Owen Wilson, says the line, "I ain't quitting you," which is so obviously a thinly veiled reference to the iconic line from Brokeback Mountain, a movie about gay cowboys, "I wish I knew how to quit you." We also get a scene where they hold hands in their last moments as they prepare to die side by side. And because I know you want to know, yes, they are the most popular pairing in the Night at the Museum fandom. Night at the Museum, incidentally, has almost 1,000 fics. And you know what? Shout out to the fanfiction writers who are writing in a fandom with under 1,000 fics. Like, that's dedication. Almost no one's reading those. Also, just a fun little fact to sprinkle in here, 23 of those fics, it turns out, are Napoleon Bonaparte / Al Capone. Because why not? So this section is for movies that I legitimately think would have been better if they made it gay. So maybe it would have added meaning to the film, had higher stakes, it would have developed a backstory better, like it just would have been better writing. When we talk about gay characters and increasing representation in the industry, we are often met with this kind of impossible duality of demands, right? So on one hand, people don't want characters that are gay for no reason. Okay, so we make a character where being gay is like a really inherent part of their character. Oh, but they also don't want gay characters where being gay is their whole personality, it's all that they are. It's a no-win scenario. And it's also never a question that we ask about straight characters. We don't need a reason to make a character straight because of course we don't. But we also don't need a reason to make a character queer either. We shouldn't be defaulting to straight for every lead, and specifically straight, white, male, able-bodied. There are stories where someone's sexuality or gender identity has no bearing on the plot, and others where it is an integral part of it, and both of those can be amazing films. There are just as many stories about gay characters as there are about straight characters. You just have to do the mental leap to put them into stories that the film industry has neglected to put them into for decades. So this film has resurfaced recently in the kind of meme discourse areas of the internet, but I'm gonna leave a discussion on like anti-Irish sentiment and British colonialism for another YouTuber in another video. We're just gonna talk about the gay stuff here. Bend It Like Beckham is a romantic comedy sports film that tells the story of Jess, a British Indian teenager who dreams of becoming a footballer. The theme of the film is basically being true to yourself in the face of family disapproval, which, you know, it's pretty gay when you think about it. Now, this is a film where the possibility of the lead characters being gay is dangled in front of us, a little worm on a hook. Jess constantly reacts throughout the film with a feeling of revulsion and disgust anytime anyone mentions her having a romantic relationship with a boy, including the iconic line, "Kissing me, a boy? You're all mad, you're all bloody mad." Like that and "You're a wanker number 9" it's peak British lesbianism, let's be real. There's a misunderstanding within the plot itself that leads to a number of supporting characters believing that the two girls are dating. Jules tells her awkwardly homophobic mother, Paula, that being a lesbian isn't even that big of a deal after she's accused of being gay. And although Paula kind of for a second seems like she might be able to reconcile and be like not the worst, later on when she's confronted with like the reality of this girl that her daughter might secretly be dating, she has this to say. "How could you be all respectful here with your lot when you've been kissing my daughter in broad daylight? Get your lesbian feet out of my shoes!" Again, like with Janice Ian in Mean Girls, we're having these interactions playing out as if they are giving us a queer storyline, but we don't actually get any representation. And in this case, it's specifically played for jokes. It's the kind of knowing farce that means that the audience knows that they aren't gay and that we're meant to laugh at these characters wildly assuming that they are. Now, obviously gender presentation in real life is no indication of sexuality or of gender identity. However, when we're looking at films where they carefully pick people's outfits, people's hairstyles, their makeup, in order to infer things about the character, we can see how these characters are presented in a way that seems like kind of gay. They choose to have Jess and Jules both dressed in a very masculine style. They wear a lot of sports clothes, they don't really do their hair or do their makeup. They have a scene where Jules and her mother go bra shopping and Jules kind of stays by the sports bras and her mum gets really annoyed at her about it. She says, "Oh no, sweetheart, not the sports bras, they're so plain." And Jules replies, "No one's going to see them." To which her mum says, "It's not how they look, it's how they make you feel." The disconnect there between mother and daughter, the fact that Paula cannot seem to comprehend that actually the way that Jules feels about those bras is bad. She doesn't like them. They don't make her feel good. This kind of projection of a very strict gender binary onto her daughter is absolutely an experience of queerness. And then there's the ending. Jess gets her self-confessed dream of going to America to play football with Jules. And although at that point she is with the romantic male interest, the football coach, that's not actually part of her dream. That's more of a, oh, we're going to try and make long distance work extra. Her happy ending is with Jules. Now, there's been unsubstantiated claims online that the original script of Bend It Like Beckham was in fact gay and the director decided to tone it down. And Keira Knightley got asked about this and this is what she had to say. "Fuck yeah, that would have been amazing. I think they should have been too. I think that would have been great. We need a sequel." And honestly, I cannot explain to you how much I would be on board with that. I made a video about these two literally years ago when The Force Awakens was released, and I stand by them as a viable couple. And I'm not the only one. Similar to Keira Knightley, Poe's actor Oscar Isaac has made no secret of how much he wanted Finn and Poe to happen. Personally, I kind of hoped and wished that maybe that would have been taken further in the other films, but I don't have control. It seemed like a natural progression, but sadly enough, it's a time when people are too afraid, I think, of, I don't know what. You know, it's something that hadn't quite been explored yet, particularly the dynamic between these two men in war that had fallen in love with each other. I would try to push it a bit in that direction, but the Disney overlords were not ready to do that. And this was such an amazingly refreshing thing to hear from an actor, especially one in such a massive franchise, because it gave fans who had seen the romantic tension and possibility between those characters the hope that they weren't crazy. They weren't seeing things or projecting their own agenda into something that isn't there. We have an actor openly saying, yeah, I tried to make that happen. That's something that I put into my performance. It's just, it wasn't made canon because of people above my pay grade. These two fight together, they protect each other. Poe is the first person to treat Finn as a human being since his childhood, but Finn also grows as an autonomous being outside of simply a hero worship of Poe. And then there's the jacket. So sharing clothes, and actually particularly giving someone your jacket in high school, the Letterman jacket thing, is very romance coded. And when they reunite and Finn tries to give Poe the jacket back, he says that he should keep it because it looks better on him. I just think if that had been a man and a woman doing that in that scene, there would have been no question that that was going to be the start of a build-up of a romantic relationship between them. And I will say this is also backed up by some crazy good chemistry between the actors involved. Interestingly, J.J. Abrams has also spoken out about Poe and Finn, describing their relationship as being a far deeper one than a romantic one, not just because of the trial by fire by which they met, but also because of their willingness to be as intimate as they are, as afraid as they are, as unsure as they are, and still be bold and still be daring and brave. This to me is a complete cop-out. The idea that they couldn't be in a queer romantic relationship and also be like brave and daring is slightly ridiculous to me. The idea that we should be grateful that we didn't get this historic queer romance in this massive franchise because actually we got something deeper, it's bullshit, my dude. We could have had a queer couple in the most mainstream sci-fi franchise in the world, and instead we got two vaguely nameless women kissing in a crowd scene. We could have had boyfriends who became generals and led the resistance together, and instead we got two buddies who got kind of shoehorned into awkward romantic relationships with women. Women who, by the way, could have had their own plot lines instead. It's a win-win for everyone. You know what? Because the fact the only canonical queer character in this entire 9-film epic series was a background kiss is bullshit, I'm gonna do another Star Wars couple. Chirrut is a blind monk with an utmost faith in the Force, while Baze is a freelance assassin hired to protect him. The old married couple energy is palpable. As writer Carl Buchanan said in his article for Slate about the film, whenever Chirrut launches into a spiel about the Force, a bemused Baze treats him like a spouse telling the upteenth iteration of a well-worn anecdote. They have these little interactions in the film that betray this kind of familiar, sentimental, despite themselves kind of affection between them. Like Baze telling Chirrut that he doesn't need the Force if he's got him. My heart, guys. And I guess, like, warning for the ending of Rogue One if you haven't seen it yet, but like, with that ending, these two enter into the pantheon of the most classic of queer tropes, the one where we always die. And looking at the way those deaths were portrayed, one of them dying in the other's arms, and then that person being spurred on by that death, charging into battle, like repeating the other's mantra to himself, like, that's gay, my dudes. And also, just because, like, why not? The novelization of Rogue One actually has some pretty gay bits in it as well, which I'm gonna read to you. Once again, the Empire had stolen meaning from Baze. He might have screamed if not for the man he held. The Force is with me, he repeated, and I am with the Force. He advanced on the men and women who had taken his past, his home, his friend, his hope, his faith, but he did not stray far from Chirrut. I mean. Speaking of an old married couple vibe, we gotta talk about Lou and Deb. Here are just some choice dialogue examples. I'm not your partner, yet. Oh honey, is this a proposal? Baby, I don't even have a diamond yet. Even Debbie explaining the reason she started dating the ex-boyfriend who put her in prison. Lou and I were going through a rough patch. They also call each other honey and baby like seconds before Debbie feeds Lou a forkful of food. To make an all-lady remake of a film and then have none of them be gay is like honestly a travesty. The classic love interest from your past, the on-again, off-again, tumultuous relationship that keep being drawn back to each other, the quippy flirting, the chaotic cool aunt vibes. You wouldn't have to change anything about the story, just like let the criminal masterminds kiss a bit, you know? And our final couple in this section, let's chat about the fresh-faced little hobbits Sam and Frodo. They go on an epic quest together, they refuse to leave each other's side, they keep each other going, and I just think it would have been cute if they had kissed, and I make no apologies for that. The romantic potential of, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you. The idea of a small but true bond of love, conquering all by sneaking into the very heart of darkness that is Mordor in order to Glad you're here with me at the end of all things, Sam. I mean. Maybe they're an established couple, maybe they discover their feelings on the road, maybe the reason why Sam was hanging out outside the window at Bag End at the beginning of the film is because he was leaving Frodo a love letter. I don't know, I'm just riffing here, guys. And you also have to love this quote from the book itself. Well, you have now, Sam, dear Sam, said Frodo, and he lay back in Sam's gentle arms, closing his eyes. Sam felt that he could sit like this in endless happiness. So this section is about movies that have a concept, background, or setting which is just like inherently queer, and yet they have no canonical queer characters. I wish I had something kind of intellectual to add to this like I did for the beginning of the other sections, but like honestly it's just a mystery. Why didn't they make it gay? Honestly, it blows my mind that Drew Barrymore managed to make a film starring Ellen Page doing roller derby and they didn't make it a queer movie. Like, that is genuinely one of the gayest sentences that I have ever uttered. In Whip It, Ellen Page plays Bliss, a girl who escapes both her mother's pressure to compete in beauty pageants and her dead-end job by trying out for a local roller derby team. So let's talk about roller derby for a second. It is not exclusively a gay sport. However, the way at which its foundations have been built in the modern era means that it is often thought of as one. While most sports are still waiting for out-professional male players or arguing about female athletes' hormone levels, the Women's Flat Track Derby Association has encoded in their policy that they are committed to inclusive and anti-discrimination practices in relation to all trans, intersex, and gender-expansive participants. Studies throughout the world have revealed how widespread this discomfort and even fear is for queer athletes. It's no coincidence how popular queer-specific, swimming classes or athletics classes or dance classes are. People want a space where they can feel comfortable, and they don't necessarily feel that way in mixed spaces. For me, it was a real missed opportunity for Whip It to be able to include this key aspect of roller derby within its story, especially because it would have fed so obviously into the themes of found family and of, carving your own path and being true to your own identity that the film has within it already. Quick question, is there anything more gay than musical theatre? Up next is the Disney Channel duo Chad and Ryan. Specifically, let's talk about Chad and Ryan's musical number in the second movie, I Don't Dance, which is so obviously a metaphorical performance about Chad's denial of his bisexuality. The clash of baseball and sports that Chad knows that is comfortable and expected, heterosexuality, with dancing that is new and a bit frightening, something he fears will end in social ridicule, homosexuality. And also the idea that he has to pick between one or the other. If you're the kind of boy who likes baseball, then you can't also be the kind of boy who likes to dance. Him and Ryan have this weird tension-filled dynamic like the whole way through the song, starting with that like bat thing. They have these little smirks and smiles and giggles that they do towards each other the whole time. It's like a courting ritual, and it ends, unfortunately not with them kissing, but it does end with them not just swapping shirts, but swapping their entire outfits and then proceeding to just kind of like sit basically in each other's laps after the game. I honestly urge you to go and check out the video for this song on YouTube because the comment section is just full of people thinking the exact same thing as me. And the whole thing honestly becomes even more hilarious when you remember that there's that whole storyline in those movies where Troy is convinced that Gabriella is cheating on him with Ryan. And then they also make Ryan and Kelsey get together. They were so desperate for us to not think that Ryan was gay, even though they had given him like every stereotype of a gay boy that they possibly could. They just didn't want to give us that rep. But joke's on them, because Kelsey's also a lesbian and her and Ryan went to the prom together as platonic queer besties. She's the Man is an iconic teen adaptation of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which, let's be real, is already pretty gay. This modernisation sees Viola disguise herself as her twin brother in order to play soccer and prove herself when her girls' team is shut down. In the movie, Olivia genuinely falls for Viola. Like, Viola is disguised as Sebastian, but it is still her. She's not pretending to be her brother in terms of personality or anything like that when they're together. Meanwhile, Amanda Bynes' Viola is busy falling for Channing Tatum's Duke. So we got ourselves a love triangle, people. And the way they solve this love triangle is to have Olivia end up with Sebastian, the boy she has never met, and who, let's be real, doesn't actually look that much like his sister disguised as him. Duke and Viola also get together, but they, similar to Mulan and Li Shang, do not even attempt to go into the implications of the fact that this boy fancied this person when he thought that they were also a boy. Like, there are so many ways in which we could have had some interesting queer exploration in this movie. We obviously could have had Viola and Olivia be together at the end. We could have even had Duke in on that as a little poly relationship, a la, Singing in the Rain from earlier in this video, or even just having any kind of exploration of Duke coming kind of into a queer identity when he realizes how much he is attracted to Viola as Sebastian. But no, we got none of that. The film does do like a tiny bit to try and critique things like Duke's kind of hyper masculine elements, where he gets kind of defensive when he's referred to as like being sensitive, or anyone suggests that he's anything less than like the ideal man. But to my mind, they don't really go far enough with even that. And the final section is about movies whose themes and allegories within them so obviously play into a queer reading, and yet they lack that representation. The issue of movies seeming to make some kind of metaphorical statement about identity or oppression when the movie itself falls into those very traps, it's like a whole thing. Like, think about movies which are like metaphorically, allegorically meant to be about racism or colonialism, but they end up not using any actors of colour, or relying on like racist stereotypes to portray the other. Like, welcome to the world of Aesop's fables for clueless adults, where we have aliens or animals or straight white dystopias in order to show you what real human beings actually go through. The first on this list, and I know we've already touched two specific examples of this one, is superheroes. People who feel different from the rest of the population, forced to live secret lives, scared of being outed, dressed in skin-tight lycra. That's gay, baby! So I started writing this section, and then I kept writing, and then I went into a massive hole of research, and I had to pull myself out of it to actually be able to finish this script on time to get this video out. But it means I'm going to be doing a whole video about superheroes and queerness, so if you are interested in seeing that, I guess subscribe so you know when that's coming out in the next couple of months. In that video, I'm going to talk about everything from that like awful, cringeworthy cameo in Endgame to the Rage comics in Queer as Folk, to the like weird coming out scene in X2. But essentially, in short, the fact that we have never had a queer lead in an MCU movie after how many movies have they produced at this point is genuinely ridiculous. Narratively, it works on so many levels. There are already so many characters to choose from across the world of comics, and some that have even been in the movies already, like Valkyrie, for example. And even what little we've had from other studios, like characters in Deadpool and Birds of Prey, I think really betray that age rating issue that I've talked about earlier in the video. The fact that we can have some queer characters or mentions, but it has to be in movies that are not the classic kind of mainstream blockbuster movies from those studios. And finally, we've got to talk about the OGs. People were seeing the gay here before you were born. It is the ship that arguably birthed what we know of as fandom today. From zines to fanfic, it was nurtured in the chalice of Kirk and Spock. It's the 23rd century, and Gene Roddenberry is imagining the beautiful, accepting world of the future. And yet, no gays. This quote from Dan Deavy, an entertainment journalist and Star Trek expert, pretty much sums up the issue here. Roddenberry's vision is that everyone is equal, everyone is accepted, there is no conflict left between human beings. So to just ignore the fact that gays exist was basically saying that we're not going to make it to the future. We're going to be gay converted at some point, and the gays will not exist. So why Kirk and Spock? Well, you've got that classic opposites attract, the cool rationality of Spock, this kind of passionate, cheeky element of Kirk. There are a number of scenes that fans point out that specifically lend themselves to a romantic reading. So let's talk about hands for a second. Vulcans, of which Spock is one, have sensitive hands. It's one of the reasons given for the Vulcan salute, the idea that, you know, as humans, normally when we greet someone, we're going to be touching hands, we're going to be handshaking, high-fiving, you know, whatever it might be. And this is the kind of greeting that you give in a species where hands are sensitive. Okay, so we've been interrupted by my cat, who is adorable and fucking massive, and she's going to attempt to sit on my lap, so I may have to get her to leave if she's meowing too much, but we're nearly finished, cat. We've been filming for like 3 hours. Please, just let me get to the end of this. So to Vulcans, touching hands means something. We see them doing the like 2-finger hand touch at weddings during Ponfar, which is like their mating ritual. Like, it's a thing. But like in the 1979 film, like at his bedside, Kirk is properly holding Spock's hand. Like they are like multi-hand holding at that point. It is well established that Kirk is dedicated to the Enterprise. Although he does have like female romantic partners, he will always like leave them behind or, you know, sacrifice that relationship for the Enterprise and his duties to her. However, he very frequently goes against protocol and against the wishes of like the higher ups within Starfleet in order to protect Spock. And when Spock is resurrected in Star Trek III, similar to Carol regaining her memories because of Maria, it is Kirk that prompts him to remember. Kirk is the first thing that he recalls. So ends our list. So I think this was a kind of part light-hearted look at the ways in which kind of queer characters can be included in any genre, any style of film, but I also think it exposes some criticisms people have of a lack of queer representation. You know, the ways in which queerness is still viewed as inherently adult, the way that it is sexualized so that even when it's just two characters, you know, holding hands or sharing an innocent kiss, it's seen as inappropriate for children. It also shows us the way that a lot of queer viewers are essentially gaslit when they point out this kind of romance coding or the chemistry or queer coding that they see within movies, and then they're told that they're crazy for even suggesting it. We can see the ways that actors like Keira Knightley and Oscar Isaac can be completely for their characters being queer. This is not something necessarily coming from actors saying that they're not comfortable with that role or anything like that, or even the writers kind of shutting it down and saying it can't happen, but people higher up within the company. I try to include in this video a mix of background information, historical context, criticism, and obviously gay yearning. So if that's up your street, then please subscribe if you want to see more videos like that. It's basically what I do on this channel. As I mentioned, upcoming videos are going to include the superhero and queerness deep dive, the long-awaited deep dive into the pirate show Black Sails and a comparison to Game of Thrones, and also one about gender and the way that it plays into modern horror films. So if any of those seem up your street, feel free to subscribe. And as always, if you want to help support me make these videos, I'm going to leave a link to my Patreon along with all my social media, so you can find me all over the internet in the description. And until I see you next time, bye. When Spock is resurrected in Star Trek 3, as I'm saying this, I'm like, this is the nerdiest I've ever been in a video. This whole video is just me being like, hi guys, have you heard about sci-fi and Lord of the Rings? But that is who I am.